Kelly Zitlow here. And once again, I have the famous Patrick McQueen with Medalist Law. Patrick, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the text this morning on to wear purple shirts. So we're coordinated somewhat here.
Right. Yeah. Well, I say famous because you're really getting traction out there. And so for everybody that's listening to this, I think it's so special that an attorney takes time. This is kind of pro bono, so it's not like I'm paying Patrick to do this, but he's so committed to bringing just valuable information to kind of break down barriers or things that we hear about some really important topics. So today, let's start with what seems to be dominating the headlines right now, at least in real estate and mortgage, and that is the NAR lawsuit and pending settlement. So Patrick, can you just kind of bring us current and give us an update? It is June 2024, so it hasn't quite hit yet. I understand that's supposed to take effect in August. I guess the first question is, do you think that date will be pushed out again?
Well, it may be. It very well may be, and we still have some road bumps to get over to finalize this settlement too. So class action lawsuits are much different than something I would go and file at my local county courthouse. You have to have all sorts of checks and balances, make sure there's a fair settlement. And it appears that from the court's perspective anyways, that we do have a fair settlement and we're moving towards implementing those terms. The wrinkle here is the Department of Justice may have some other say in how this is going to be administered and how this is going to be handled and what happens in the future. And so as far as I can tell, everything is going forward as of August 17th or somewhere around there, August 14th, August 17th. And so what we're seeing are in practice anyways, a lot of real estate agents who are starting to kind of get the hang of things or try to do things a little bit differently. We've actually created, as a law firm, we've created a single property buyer broker agreement for all of those rush situations where a prospective buyer wants to buy a house and you need to get something signed now based on the rules. So people are starting to get the gears going. We've also seen a lot of misunderstandings as well, as if it's already August 17th because we're in June still. We've seen people, sellers and buyers, who are basically saying, well, based on this lawsuit, I don't have to pay anything and I'm not going to pay anything. And we're already seeing lawsuits based on these threats or these statements by either sellers or buyers. And so there is so much confusion out there still, but we do see a lot of people starting to try to implement what is required under these settlement terms.
Yeah. So let's dive into that. I mean, first of all, what do you think that maybe the top 3 misunderstandings are from just a general public type of situation? Then we'll move into real estate professionals. But if I'm a consumer, I'm thinking about selling my house or buying a house, what is it that I need to know? And where do you think some misunderstandings are?
Yeah, so I think the lawsuit was a big misunderstanding.
Okay, noted. I'm writing that.
I would say there's probably 9 or 10 sort of industry-wide practice changes that will go into effect. The biggest sort of change, or the biggest sort of, hey, this is what happened here. This is their, waving of the flag. This is their victory salute. Is that the NAR must eliminate the requirement that listing agents compensate buyer's agents. That's the big headline. The 6% commission is going away. That's a little bit of a misstatement. That's not really necessarily a change. That may have been the customary way to handle a co-broke situation, but it was never, ever required. And so we're already seeing that. That's where the confusion comes in, is saying, I don't have to pay anything. I don't have to do anything. You can't hold me to this anymore. And it's all based on that misunderstanding. And so you see a lot of the plaintiffs' attorneys and a lot of the headlines are saying that this commission requirement, they call it a requirement, is gone now. It was never a requirement in the first place. Sellers were always free to set that compensation. Perhaps it was different in, I practice mostly here in Arizona. I deal with real estate agents mostly in Arizona, and they were seemingly doing it the right way. And so I can only imagine that these came out of somewhere else, that there was a problem. And so these big sort of blanket statements of, the NAR and others must eliminate, prohibit any requirement that offers of compensation, if made, be blanket, unconditional, or unilateral. Again, always been up to the seller. So that's really the big sort of, hey, a little bit of a red herring, as we say in the law, when it's kind of a diversion or a head fake here. The other change, though, it is a real change, which is the offers of compensation can't be made via the MLS anymore. That's a change. The requirement now that that buyers brokers have to get a buyer's broker's agreement signed prior to showing properties, that's a change. But other than that, that's it. I mean, so one of them's a head fake. One or two of them are real changes. And then the rest are things that people should have been doing in the first place or should not have been doing in the first place. So, is this really a big change? Yeah, I guess, but it's not as big of a change as I think a lot of people are thinking it is.
Yeah, and I think it's so confusing for, the person that's not following the intricacies of what's really taking place with this. I think it, to me, sounds like more of a transparency kind of desire and ensuring that sellers understand what their right is, what they can do with regard to commissions. But I've talked to so many real estate agents, and so many of them, at least in this market, and I do think that market specifics will drive truly what happens. But if we think about maybe a balanced market, that's where it's not a seller's market and balance, I'll say balanced to maybe buyer's market. In those scenarios, it might be important for the seller to consider paying a buyer's agent commission, because they want more eyes on their house, right? And they don't want their house sitting for a long time. And the agents I'm talking to are like, Kelly, this is what we talk about already. So when we're doing a listing presentation, we're talking with the seller about whatever their commission is. And then if they're wanting to pay a buyer's commission and why that would be important to them. So I feel like a lot of what you're saying is what I'm hearing on the street when talking to real estate agents, but it's not what is being communicated out to the masses. And I think that's really where the concern is from my perspective. That said, here's what I think we get tricky. And that is, if we ever move back to truly a seller's market, and a seller's market is where there is a lot of demand from buyers to buy houses, and there's not enough inventory. So then therefore you start to see offerings over list price, you start to see waiving inspections, you start to see waiving appraisal, you start to see all that type of stuff that happens. And in that scenario, I could see potentially a seller saying, time on market right now is 48 hours in my area, my subdivision. I don't feel like I need to really pay a buyer's agent. Let's walk through that, because I think that's really where the rubber hits the road.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the word transparency, and I want to go back to that really quickly, because that's what this whole thing has been about, is transparency. I don't know what I'm paying. I don't know where my money's going, etc. Well, now we're eliminating the place in which we were sort of putting this advertisement out there as to 3%, 2%, 2.5%, whatever the co-broke was. And now we're going to be having these secretive conversations. What are we doing here? Is this really a transparency thing? I don't know. So yeah, I think that the promotion of transparency kind of cuts both ways on this new settlement and the way things are going to go. But to answer your question, in a true seller's market, where a seller says, I'm not going to pay for a buyer's agent to come in here, or I'm not going to offer that, I do think that's a risk. But I think that what buyer's agents need to do in that situation is to really tout all of those things you just brought up. Because there will be some situations where buyer's agents are not going to be compensated by the seller or the selling agent. It's going to need to be coming from the buyer themselves and paid outside, however they're going to do it. But that is where a good buyer's agent touts all of their services, touts their ability to, explain an appraisal waiver, to explain what happens if you do waive an appraisal, if you do waive inspections, if you do these certain things that could be very, very risky. So a good buyer's agent is going to be able to explain all of those things. And I'm telling this story from my own personal anecdote. I've got my own situation that I dealt with 20 some years ago, fresh out of law school. I thought I knew how to run a real estate transaction. I thought I knew exactly what I was doing. It was a seller's market at the time. And I go, all right, I can do it. I'll do it on my own. And boy, did I get smoked. I didn't know where to go for an inspection. I didn't know what appraisal, this, that, the other thing. I didn't know any of that stuff. And I'm sure I got smoked on the price, right? And probably other terms. So I didn't have those connections that we sometimes need to rely on from our real estate agents. And so that to me is the perfect example of why you should pay for a buyer's agent. It's because it's like the dentists who don't do their own dental work, or the brain surgeons who don't give themselves brain surgery. It just doesn't make sense to do that. As attorneys, we see people who do things on their own as well. And that's largely what we're litigating is people who didn't go for that sort of ounce of prevention at the beginning of the day. So yeah, you're right. It's going to happen. But I think ultimately those people may end up getting a worse deal at the end of the day.
Let's talk about dual agency, because I feel like, if we run through a scenario, let's say that the listing agent is holding a house open. It's an open house. And the buyer is just, walking by and decides to go in. And let's say they do not have a buyer broker agreement executed. So at this point, they're a free agent. They go in, they love the house. And maybe in that scenario, the seller is not paying towards a buyer's agent commission. So what I think people think is that they're going to save money just using the listing agent. Can you comment on that type of representation and only what a buyer gets, because it may not be what they think?
I mean, you said it better than I can. There are certain situations under Arizona law, under the laws of other states, where dual agency or dual representation, where the same person is representing the seller and the buyer, it's allowed. And I've never, ever, ever been a fan of this, because I think somebody is going to end up with some form of hard feelings. Even if the agent does everything above board, somebody's not going to be happy based on some sort of decision, based on the feeling of unfair treatment. So it's allowed, but in most of these situations, it's like, no, I'm going to refer you to somebody else to help document this so that it feels a little bit better, or what have you. So as a buyer, I don't think I would want it either. And it would just be there'd just be a little bit of enough doubt in my mind. As a seller, same thing. There would just be a little bit of is he or she favoring this buyer or the seller over me? Why did they say it this way? And you're consenting, though, to a form of limited representation, and it truly is limited. It's limited by the fact that the other party is being represented. In almost no other sort of areas of significance, I can't do it. I can't represent. I don't do divorce law, but to me it'd be like representing a husband and a wife in a divorce. Somebody's not going to be happy with me at the end of the day, and somebody's not going to be happy with the way this works out at the end of the day. So there's just a lot of risk in the dual agency. So I do think a lot of people are expecting that a seller's agent will represent them as well, et cetera. But I just don't think it's a good idea.
So let's take that same scenario, and maybe the buyer has already executed a buyer broker agreement with a real estate agent. And so now they have representation, but the real estate agent isn't with them, and they just happen to walk into this open house and they fall in love with it. And the listing agent tells them that, asks one, do you have a real estate agent? Yes, I do. Two, have you signed your buyer broker? Yes, I have. Let's say that. And now what? Like, where does that conversation go now?
It should be, well, if you like this enough, have your agent write an offer and send it to me, right? It usually needs to stop once a determination's been made that somebody is under a buyer broker, because otherwise you may get into some interference types of claims. There's some ethical issues as well. So it really needs to stop at that point.
And should the listing agent at that point, so you're saying just refer back to the buyer agent and then let the agents discuss, but should the listing agent be communicating anything about the seller's willingness to pay a buyer's agent in that context to a consumer?
Ooh. I think once there's been a statement made that, hey, I'm represented, I think it all needs to stop. I think the conversation needs to stop at that point. Yeah. So I think you've signed that buyer broker agreement. You've agreed to pay whatever commission you're agreeing to pay. And I don't know that conversation isn't going to be very helpful. Somebody's not going to be happy after that conversation happens. So if it was me on the other side, I would just say that's something you need to talk to your real estate agent about.
Yeah. So let's continue. So let's say, okay, I go back to talk to my real estate agent and I love this house. I absolutely love this house. I have to have this house. And the real estate agent then proceeds to tell me, well, the situation is the seller's not paying the commission. So we can do a couple of things. Either one, we can go in higher than the list price to cover the amount that you owe me as a buyer's agent. In that scenario, if they're using financing, the house would have to appraise for that in order for all of the economics to work in that scenario. And I think that's really important because I hear a lot of people saying, well, we'll just increase the price to pay for the buyer's agent commission. It could work, but it could also not work if the house doesn't appraise. So important piece there. And then second, let's just say that that's not the strategy and the buyer needs to come up with the money to pay the agent, their agent. That's where I feel, and I'm going to say this word, and it's going to be really not what you want me to say, but I feel like that's where disparity is going to be created between the haves and the have-nots. And by that, I mean, if you have an entry-level buyer that's just scraping by to be able to buy a house, put their money down, pay for closing costs, and now they've got this situation where they don't have any extra money to be able to pay for representation. Okay. Right? Versus somebody that does have the ability to pay for it. What were they thinking here? I get the transparency. I totally get it. I think we need it. But I think that now, it's kind of now what are we creating by this particular settlement? I think we're opening up a can of worms and we're opening up the ability for people to now not have representation. So either they're violating their buyer broker or they're choosing not to sign a buyer broker. And then they're getting themselves into a position where they have no representation and they don't know what they're doing. So I feel like it's just a can of worms, Patrick.
I feel like that issue hasn't been really thought through. I also think that there's the potential for, and I don't know if you call it discrimination or some sort of treating people differently, right? I guess that's discrimination. But let's say that I'm offering 3% to one particular agent, but the agents from that brokerage, I'm only going to give them 1.5% if I'm selling.
I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, or hey, so that's the one that gets me as well. Is, well, for this type of buyer, I'm only going to offer this. For that type of buyer, I'll offer this. For this brokerage coming in, I don't know if that's going to happen. I hope not. But that's the other concern I have, and that's this whole transparency thing that I'm talking about. Is it almost seems like I can offer different amounts to different buyers and buyers agents. I don't know if that was intended, but we're talking about transparency here. That doesn't seem very transparent to me. So maybe that was intended. Maybe they wanted that to be part of, hey, you're offering me something completely different than what this particular buyer is offering me. Therefore, I'm going to give you more. Who knows? I don't know. Yeah. But that to me seems a little not so transparent as well.
Yeah. So let's go back to the MLS. So part of the settlement is that the compensation can no longer be registered or noted in MLS. You had mentioned that. So in that scenario, how will an agent know what the seller is contributing towards a buyer's agent commission? I've heard that they will now direct people to maybe their own website, a brokerage website, an agent website with their a listing, so then if you're the buyer's agent, you can go to that website and check to see what the commission is. So that's one way. But I think I'm really interested in knowing, tell me about the Zillows of the world and the Redfins of the world and these online, really their marketing services of real estate. Like, are they going to be able to showcase and indicate what the commission is, or are they precluded by this?
That's,
No.
I don't know the answer. I definitely don't know the answer. To backtrack a little bit, you're 100% correct that there will be more websites offering this stuff up. And when you come to kind of a dead end and you can't figure out if there is a commission for a particular property, do you stop looking for your client at that point and you go to the ones that you can get and find information on? Is it going to require a lot more conversations and phone calls? I think yes. Is it going to require text messages? Yes. One of the other suggestions that I've heard out there, and I think it's probably pretty applicable, is like what we do in the commercial world is we have an LOI and we start spelling out in the LOI how this commission portion is going to go. So you at least have something in writing if it's not evident on the website, because I don't know that the websites are going to contain all of the information that you need. As to the Zillows, as to the Redfins, they're going to figure a way around all of this stuff. I can guarantee it. They're good at that. And so I have no idea what they're going to do, but they're going to figure a way around all of this stuff and make it easier for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It'll be interesting. It's an interesting time in this business, right? So what is the one thing? I mean, we talked about a lot of things, but is there any additional kind of one thing that nobody's talking about that keeps you up at night when it comes to the NAR settlement?
I may have mentioned this at the beginning, but it may get, completely kiboshed by the Department of Justice. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that that's still ongoing. You always feel in kind of big litigation like this, like there's some other shoe to drop kind of a thing. It seems like people are slowly transitioning and getting used to the idea of the new things that we talked about. But ultimately, I feel like there's going to be something that comes in, and I think it's probably from the DOJ to try to mess things up.
Is there a timeline on what that would look like? So right now, this is set to take effect, if approved, right? August 17th. So could it be like on August 16th is when it comes in and the DOJ says, oh, no? Because every brokerage out there across the country, every real estate agent, they're all working, doing all this work to try to get ready for this thing. But you're saying there's a possibility that the DOJ says, we don't think so.
Yeah, and this hurts those buyers that you described earlier, and this hurts these types of a little bit differently, then it's not fair to this group of people, whatever it is. I think it can come in after court approves it. So I think it can come anytime.
Wow. Okay.
I think those are two separate things. And so I think it could come in even after August 17th.
So then the entire real estate industry would have to unwind everything that they've been doing.
Now, hopefully that doesn't happen, but yeah, that could. I think that's a real possibility.
Wow. And it feels to me, even if they happen to, the DOJ comes in and says, nope, not going to happen, and here's why. It feels to me, in some respect, the train already left the station because of the amount of coverage that this topic has gotten, whether it is on point, whether it's slanted, whether it's accurate or not. It's just everywhere you turn. So it'll be interesting to see if that's the case, like how all of this unwinds. And I do think that at the end of the day, if that happens, there is probably a good lesson here for all of us to take to heart, which is just be transparent,
And, again, I practice a lot in Arizona, and I think people did a really, really good job. And so this is kind of impacting us here in Arizona, unfortunately, a little bit differently than perhaps some of the other states where maybe they weren't as clean on the transparency thing. I think get that buyer broker signed up front, be transparent, and you're good, right? And if you're a buyer, right, and you want somebody to represent you, you're going to have to sign a buyer broker agreement.
Right.
And the funny thing is, I think, is I've had more clients or potential clients ask for a consultation about them signing a buyer broker agreement than ever before. So, hey, I bought many houses, but now my agent is requiring or requesting that I sign this buyer broker agreement. I wanted to have it looked over by an attorney before I sign it, before this goes into effect. Can you explain this to me? Why should I, as a buyer, sign this? And from a legal perspective, there's one very good reason to sign it as a buyer. And that is because then your buyer's agent can't come after you for more than what's in that buyer broker agreement, right? So there is a way that this stuff protects you, and it is to limit your potential exposure for a commission here to 2.5%, whatever you guys have agreed upon. And so, now more than ever, I've been asked that question. Well, why should I sign this? Well, number one, you have to sign it if you want representation. But number two, from a legal perspective, it actually does protect you. And so that's how, in my opinion, a good buyer's agent is going to be able to pitch this and say, look, this means I can't come after you for more than what we've already agreed upon. And so at least that dialogue is happening as well.
Do you find yourself also kind of the third piece of that conversation, explaining what a buyer's agent does?
Yeah, I for me personally, I explain sort of the benefits of that I've received over the years in using a buyer's agent. It's getting a better pricing. It's knowing who to call, which lenders to use, which lenders not to use, which appraisers, or not appraisers, can't use appraisers, which inspectors, what type of due diligence, where do I go for this type of due diligence?
Right.
So I don't necessarily get into those types of, the particulars of this is what agent A or B will be doing for you.
Yeah.
I just sort of relate it to, well, this is the type of stuff that happened for me, and this is the type of stuff that might be important for me. It may be important for you, and then it kind of, light bulb goes off and goes, oh yeah, I need that stuff. I need to know where I'm going, that kind of thing. And so, being able to tout kind of my own personal experience with buying agents.
Yeah.
Again, I could do this stuff on my own. I have a law license. The law license allows me to do it on my own. I'm not going to do it though.
Right. You've been there, done that.
Yes, I know better now.
And you mentioned price negotiations, but in my seat as a lender for 28 years, I'll tell you, real estate agents are so important to the entire process because it's not just about price. Then you get into the home inspection, and there's generally maybe additional negotiations that have to happen because of that. Maybe the appraisal, maybe it doesn't appraise for the purchase price. Now you have additional conversations or negotiations that have to happen. So just throughout the entire process, having representation for your scope of what you are, whether you're a seller or a buyer, having your own personal consultation or representation, I think is just, it's so important, and I just don't think like you can do this, but you don't know all the steps. You don't know all the pieces. And how many at-bats have you had in these conversations? There's so much finesse that goes on. And I think real estate agents really just don't get the kudos or the acknowledgement of really what they do to move a buyer or a seller through the home buying or selling process. So I appreciate the fact that you go through this. And
there's so much, in just the documents that they have that they use and the language that they use. I'm in real estate law, but I don't use those documents. I don't look that language. I don't know the next step to do this necessarily in all real estate transactions. And so people who are skilled in that are a very, very valuable asset.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, thank you once again for sharing your insights on the NAR settlement. I'm sure you will keep us posted, and we'll keep this audience posted as well.
Definitely. Thank you.